Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's editions of my top starts and sits for week 8 of this NFL season. As always, you're going to get my top 2 starts and sits for the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position. And as you guys know, they've been following along with me all season long. I'm going to start with the quarterback position, so let's just dive right into it. Now, I will say my top quarterback sits this week. These are more streaming options because, the quarterbacks of like Patrick Mahomes and Jalen Hurts, the guys I don't have to tell you to start, they have the really good matchups to take advantage of this week. And I'm not going to tell you guys to start the obvious plays on these videos. So yeah, I got a couple streaming options at the quarterback spot. So let's go ahead and dive into it. My top start of the week, I'm actually gonna go with Kenny Pickett against the Jaguars. The Jaguars have allowed the fourth most points per game to the quarterback position this season. And then when you look at the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different quarterbacks to throw over 300 yards against their defense. They've only given up 5 touchdowns. They've actually picked off quarterbacks 7 times, but as you guys know, interceptions don't take away from your big point total, so there's nothing to stress about there. But my main thing is they've been giving up a lot of yards through the air. I know their top cornerback, Tyson Campbell, missed last week's game, and if he has to miss this game, that bodes well for like a George Pickens out there on the boundary. So I can see a Kenny Pickett getting more of his probably one of the few ceiling games that you can get out of him in fantasy football. So if you have been streaming quarterbacks, I think he's a good play this week. And then if you're looking for a cheap option in your daily lineups, he's a name to consider. Another name to consider as a streaming option or as a cheap option in your daily lineups this week, I am going to go with Sam Howell against the Eagles defense. The Eagles are tied for the most points per game allowed this season to quarterbacks, giving up 17.2 points per game. Now, these two teams actually faced off against each other 4 weeks ago. He actually had 330 total yards and a touchdown against that Eagles defense. 290 of the yards came through the air, and then he ran the ball 6 times for 40 yards against the Eagles defense. And then as far as the last 4 games, they have allowed 3 different 215 plus passing yard games, and they have allowed 4 touchdowns and just 1 interception over the last 4 games. So not giving up a lot of touchdowns to quarterbacks, but I'm more of this is just betting on the success that Sam Howell had against them last time. For whatever reason, the last couple years, this Commanders team has played Philadelphia really well. It's a divisional opponent. So I see this being like a game like last time where Howell's going to finish closer to his ceiling than to his floor against Philadelphia. Moving into my top sits, my top sit of the week. I am going to go with Joe Burrow against the 49ers. Now, seasonal leagues, he looks like he's bounced back right before the bye week, so I can get it why you'd play him. So if you do play him in your seasonal leagues, this is if for the people that have been following along with me. You've heard this before. This is a temporary expectation play, and what a temporary expectation play to me is, yeah, I'm going to play this guy, but you also have to understand that he may finish at his floor or below his floor based on the matchup. Now, as far as like the daily lineups, this is a name I would definitely be looking to avoid in those. When we look at this matchup against the 49ers, they've allowed 11.5 points per game to the quarterback position. That is the 3rd fewest across the NFL. Over the last 4 games, there's been 2 games where they have held the quarterback to less than 200 yards passing. And then they have allowed 5 touchdowns, but they have also picked off the quarterback 6 times in the last 4 games. And then, Kirk Cousins obviously had a great game. He outperformed his expectations last week, so maybe that could happen for Joe. But another thing to factor in too is that one Jordan Addison long touchdown before halftime, that probably should have been an interception, so it probably should be 4 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. But yeah, it's this 49ers defense. Obviously they were a little bit of a letdown against Minnesota, but when you look at the larger sample size, they've been very good against quarterbacks this year. My other top sit, I am going to go with Geno Smith against the Browns. The Browns have only given up 13.6 points per game to quarterbacks this year. That's the 7th fewest in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, they've actually held quarterbacks to less than 200 yards passing in 3 of the 4 games. And they've given up 5 touchdowns, picked off the quarterback 2 times. So yeah, it's just similar to the 49ers defense, right? Both of these defenses are kind of coming off games where quarterbacks performed well against, or somewhat performed well against them. But when you look at the larger sample size, they've been really good against quarterbacks. So the sample size throughout the season says that Geno is probably going to finish more to his floor or less than it. But if you can exceed the expectations, if you do play him, then that's great for you. But I would look for other options this week. Moving into my running back starts and sits of the week, my running back start of the week, I am going to go with Isaiah Pacheco against the Broncos. The Broncos have given up 30.4 points per game to running backs this year. That's easily the most allowed in the NFL. These two teams actually faced off 2 weeks ago on that Thursday night game, and Pacheco finished with 98 total yards against their defense. And then when we look at the last 4 games, Denver has allowed 2 different running backs to run over 100 yards. And then they've been a little bit better at keeping running backs out of the end zone. They've only allowed 2 touchdowns to running backs over the last 4 games, but I'm betting on Pacheco's success from the last game that he played against Denver. Almost went over that 100-yard mark. Didn't get in the end zone, so he's due to get in the end zone against the Broncos, so that's why I like Pacheco as a play in Week 8. My other top start, I am going to go with Dameon Pierce against the Panthers. The Panthers have allowed 29.3 points per game to running backs this year. That is the second most allowed. When we look at the last 4 games, they have been getting gashed on the ground. They have allowed 2 different running backs to go over 100 rushing yards, and then they also have allowed 2 other different running backs to run over 95 yards against their defense in the last 4 games. And then when you look at the touchdown production, they have allowed 8 total touchdowns, 7 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown to running backs over the last 4 games. They're giving up 2 touchdowns a game, basically, to running backs. So I think you've got to hammer Pierce in your lineups this week, and I think he's going to give people a more of a ceiling performance than what we've seen out of him throughout the start of the year. Moving into the sits, I'm going to go with my top one. I'm going with Brian Robinson Jr. against the Eagles. The Eagles have only allowed 8.7 points per game to running backs this year. That's the fewest across the NFL. Now, these 2 teams did face off 4 weeks ago, like I mentioned about Sam Howell. In that game, Robinson Jr. finished with 51 total yards. He did have a touchdown, so I always like to remind people, touchdowns can kind of make people's fantasy performances look better than what it is. So you take that touchdown away, he just had 51 yards. So this is a touchdown-based matchup for me, which I mean is if he doesn't get in the end zone, he's probably not going to get the yards for you. So you got to pray that he gets in the end zone. And then when we look at what the Eagles have done against running backs over their last 4 games, the most yards they've allowed on the ground to a single running back has been 53 yards, and then they only allowed 2 running back rushing touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. So I definitely would look to avoid Robinson Jr. this week. My other sits, I am going to go with Jonathan Taylor and Zach Moss against the Saints. Now, Zach Moss, I definitely think you should sit him. Jonathan Taylor, I will say this, he looked like himself this past week. I think he's going to start seeing his normal workload, which is why I think you should sit Moss, because I think you're going to see Moss's touches slowly decrease over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Now, Taylor, I view him as a temporary expectation play. If you don't have a better option in your league to play somebody with a better matchup, I understand why you would play him, because he's going to get the volume of touches. So with temporary expectations, but Taylor would be a name I would look to avoid in my daily fantasy lineups. Now let's look at the matchup. The Saints have only given up 11.2 points per game to running backs this year. That is the second fewest across the league. And then over the last 4 games, the most rushing yards they have allowed is only 58 yards, and they have also only allowed 2 running back touchdowns. So I view both of these sits as basically, if they don't get you a touchdown, they're probably going to finish anywhere between 50 to 70 yards and not get much for you. So if you have better options than these guys, I definitely would try to play those guys, play the better matchups over these players. If you have to play a Jonathan Taylor, I totally get it. I mean, I've considered it, but luckily in the league I do have Taylor in. I am pretty stacked at the running back position because I got him late in the 6th or 7th round, so I already drafted a number of running backs, so I can handle a Taylor on my bench this week based on the matchup. Moving into my top starts and sits. For the wide receiver position, my top start of the week, I'm going to go with DJ Moore against the Chargers. Chargers have allowed 30.6 points per game to wide receivers this year. That's easily the most allowed in the NFL. And then when we look at the last 4 games, they have allowed 2 different wide receivers to go over 100 receiving yards, and they've given up 5 touchdowns to wide receivers over the last 4 games. And one thing I kept in my mind is Daniel Jeremiah, Mr. Move the Sticks himself. He actually does the radio calls for the Chargers, and on his podcast this week, he talked about how these alpha players, when they face like alpha players like DJ Moore, like the lead player, the best skill position player on the opposing team, whenever they face the Chargers, they do tend to go off, and they're the reason why the Chargers have actually lost a lot of these games this year. So I think Moore is going to have a great performance on Sunday. My other start, Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk against the Steelers. Obviously, Calvin Ridley's he's kind of disappointed, but especially he didn't really do much against the Saints. But when you look back at the tape, he was double teamed quite often in that game. So I see a bounce back performance in this game for Calvin Ridley. And then Christian Kirk's kind of just been that steady Eddie PPR machine this week, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has a ceiling performance against Pittsburgh. When we look at this matchup, Pittsburgh has allowed the second most points per game to wide receivers. That is, they give up 28.4 points per game. Over the last 4 games, they have actually allowed 3 different wide receivers to go over 100 receiving yards, and they've given up 4 touchdowns of wide receivers over that time period as well. So again, I think Ridley's a bounce back play, and I see Kirk reaching more of a ceiling performance out of him in this matchup. My top sits, I am going to go, my top one, I'm going with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf against the Browns. Browns have only given up 15.5 points per game to wide receivers this year. That is the second fewest across the league. Only one receiver has gone over the 100 receiving yard mark in the last 4 games, and they've only allowed 2 touchdowns to wide receivers. So they're a great defense. I already talked about Geno, how I could see him having a bad game. I mean, the Browns defense is really one of the better defenses on third down. Yes, the Colts did find success against them, but I think that was more of a Shane Steichen factor, not a Browns letdown factor. So I definitely would see a floor performance out of Lockett and Metcalf against the Browns. My top sit. Other top sit, I'm going with Marquise Brown against the Ravens. You can include Michael Wilson. You include Rondale Moore in that as well. If you're like looking at these daily lineups for a cheap option. But yeah, I would avoid these Cardinals wide receivers, especially Marquise Brown in your seasonal leagues. Going against this Ravens defense that somehow is still underrated. Not a lot of people, I feel like, are talking about how well they have played this year. But when we look at the fantasy matchup, they're only giving up 15.9 points per game to wide receivers this year. That's the third fewest in the NFL. Over the last 2 games, they have allowed 2 different wide receivers to go over 100 yards, but they've only allowed 1 touchdown to wide receivers this week. And I think with Marquise Brown being that lead dog, I think they're going to try to take him away and not let him get that revenge game against his former team in Week 8. Moving into my top starts and sits for the tight end position. My top start, he's been on fire as of late, but I think he's going to continue that success. I'm going to go with Darren Waller against the Jets defense. The Jets are giving up 10.5 points per game to tight ends this year. That is the most allowed in the NFL. Over the last 4 games, 2 different tight ends have finished over 60 plus receiving yards, and they have allowed 3 touchdowns to tight ends over the last 4 games. So giving up the yards, giving up the touchdowns, and then Waller is also playing well, so I definitely think you should keep him in your lineup for Week 8. My other start, this could be a sneaky streaming option, a sneaky cheap option on daily lineups. I am going to go with that rookie tight end in Las Vegas, Michael Mayer against the Lions. Lions are giving up 9.6 points per game to tight ends. That's the second most allowed this year. They've only allowed 1 tight end to finish over 60 plus receiving yards, but they have also allowed a lot of yards to the tight end position, but they've just faced teams that didn't have like an alpha tight end. The yardage was kind of just spread throughout the rest of the group. But just like that Jets defense, they have also allowed 3 tight end touchdowns over the last 4 games. So I'm betting on Mayer having a better performance, especially I think Jimmy Garoppolo is going to be back in this lineup. based on what I heard last week. I did not look at the practice report, but it is in Las Vegas. They might be practicing right now as we speak. But the last thing I saw was that he was supposed to be back this week. So as long as Jimmy G's back in there, I would definitely try to fire up Michael Mayer if you've been streaming tight ends this season. My top sit now. Mark Andrews against the Cardinals. You guys heard me say this about Joe Burrow, Jonathan Taylor. Yeah, you're going to play Mark Andrews in your seasonal leagues. Totally. Daily lineups, this would be a name I would consider not playing this week, just based on this matchup. As far as the matchup, Arizona has only given up 3.8 points per game to tight ends this season. That is actually tied for the second fewest across the league. And when we look at the last 4 games, the most yards a single tight end has gained against Arizona has only been 26 yards, and they haven't allowed a tight end touchdown over the last 4 games. So not giving up yards, not allowing tight ends to get into the end zone. So I see this being more of a floor performance out of Mark Andrews. But let me reiterate, it's a seasonal leagues. It's a temper your expectations. Of course, you're going to play Mark Andrews, but I would definitely sit him in any of your daily lineups and look for other options like a Michael Mayer, when you put those FanDuel, those DraftKings lineups together. As far as my other top sit, I am going to go with David Njoku against the Seahawks. Seahawks are only giving up 4.3 points per game to tight ends. That is the third fewest across the league. Came out today that Deshaun Watson is going to be not going to play in this game. It is going to be PJ Walker, so you cannot trust this quarterback situation as of right now. And then when we look at the last 4 games, what the Seattle, what the Seattle defense has done to tight ends, the most yards a single tight end has gained against Seattle over the last 4 weeks has been only 29 yards. And just like the Cardinals defense over the last 4 games, they haven't allowed a tight end to get into the end zone. So not allowing yards to tight ends, not allowing them to get in the end zone. So, and then you factor in that he's going to be playing with a backup quarterback. For those reasons, I would look for other options than Njoku this week. But yeah, that is my top starts and sits for week 8 of this NFL season. As always, guys, if you have any questions about players I did not speak about in this video, feel free to hit me up in a DM or get in the comment sections. I always try to get back to people as soon as I can. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button, depending on what social media platform you're following this on. And then as always, guys, I will see you next Tuesday when I do my top waiver wire and streamable defenses video. I'll see you guys then. I hope you guys win your matchups this week. Peace out and enjoy the rest of your week.